Chapter 1. Tuscumbia. Helen Keller was born in June of 1880 in Tuscumbia, Alabama, a small, sleepy, very southern town. In her own words, the beginning of my life was simple and much like every other little life. I came, I saw, I conquered, as the first baby in the family always does. But at the age of 19 months she came down with a raging fever, and what was called acute congestion of the stomach and brain. And after that, no part of her life would ever be simple again. The doctor had said she might not recover, yet early one morning the fever left as suddenly as it came. She fell into a peaceful sleep. Waking from time to time she saw light and dark, with the light growing dimmer day by day, until there was only dark. Her mother, Kate, was giving Helen a bath when she happened to pass a hand in front of the baby's eyes, and it seemed to her that the eyes never blinked. She did it again, and again there was no response, no movement of the eyelids. No matter how many times she tried, it was always the same. She understood that her little girl was blind. They took her by train to a doctor in Union City, Tennessee, a long journey, during which Helen shrieked without stopping. When they got there, the doctor said there was nothing to be done for her eyes. Soon her parents learned the child was deaf as well. One evening, when the bell was rung for dinner, they noticed that she had made no move to go, so they rattled a tin can filled with stones that had once been one of her favorite toys. She never turned her head. They spoke to her gently, they yelled, but nothing changed. She had learned to speak quite early, using a handful of words that strangers might not have recognized as words, but when she stopped hearing human speech, she stopped trying to speak, although not all at once. It happened slowly over time. The last word she remembered was water, and she went on making some sound for it after all other words were gone. Once her strength returned, Helen was as healthy, alert, and energetic as she used to be. She had no way of knowing that the rest of the family saw and heard and spoke, or that she was in any way different from them, and she began doing what every child does. She explored her world, poking her fingers into anything they met, touching, tasting, sniffing, pinching. By following with her hands the movements and operations of other hands, she learned what those other hands were up to and began to imitate them. The family that surrounded her tried to carry on with ordinary life as if this enormous tragedy had never fallen on them. What else could they do? It was a sizable family. The father, Arthur Keller, had been a captain in the Confederate Army. Helen's cousin Layla described him as a splendid man, large and fine-looking, and a genuine Christian. 20 years older than Kate, a widower when they married, he had 2 sons, James, who was about the same age as Kate, and William, a teenager the family called by his middle name, Simpson. The sons addressed their father as captain, and so did everyone else. He was the editor and publisher of a weekly newspaper. Like many upper-middle-class Southerners in the years after the Civil War, he owned parcels of land here and there, as well as the family home. But he was always short of money. He was a devoted father, although often a wrong-headed one. Kate Adams Keller, the captain's young second wife, had a large Southern household to run, which meant curing hams, putting up jellies and preserves, looking after the poultry, the vegetable garden, the old-fashioned flower garden, and supervising the black servants who lived in the same shacks they had occupied 15 years earlier when they were slaves. Kate worked alongside them from early morning until after dinner. She was reserved in nature, thoughtful and inward-looking, and a great reader. So there were the father and mother, the 2 big sons, the little girl who was locked inside her own body, and Evelyn Keller, the captain's older sister, known as Aunt Ev. Their home was about a mile out of town. In addition to the main house, Ivy Green, there were barns, stables, chicken coops, outhouses, a smokehouse, the servants' shacks, and a garden cottage. None of it was grand. Even in Ivy Green, none of the rooms was large or generous. It was a working farm in a rural backwater. If there was a single school for the blind anywhere in Alabama, Kate had never heard of it. She went about her daily tasks and thought her private thoughts, with Helen going everywhere her mother went, clutching her skirts. Before the illness had been a much-loved and loving child, and she still was. Her playmates had been Martha Washington, the cook's little daughter, and Belle, an old hunting dog, and they were her playmates now. She bullied them just as she used to, and in her own way she was still talkative. She had learned to talk with signs. By the time Helen was 5, she had invented about 50 signs, some for people, some for things. A pull meant come, a shove meant go. When she wanted bread, she acted out the cutting of slices and buttering them. Pinching a tiny bit of skin on her hand meant small. Spreading her fingers wide and bringing her hands together meant large. If it was ice cream she wanted, she shivered and made the motion of turning the handle of the ice cream freezer. She had a different sign for every member of the household. Glasses for her father, a stroking motion against the cheek for her mother. She knew when company came because she felt the opening and shutting of the front door. When they left, she waved her hand for goodbye from a vague memory of what the gesture meant. She learned what keys were for and one day locked her mother in the pantry when everyone else was out of earshot. Kate spent 3 hours pounding furiously on the pantry door, while Helen sat outside on the front steps enjoying the vibrations of the pounding. She was strong, active, reckless, and she was beginning to understand that other people talked with their lips. When she moved her own lips the same way, nothing happened. Sometimes this made her so angry that she kicked and screamed until she was exhausted. It seemed to her that herself, her normal childhood self, was taken over at times by another self, a powerful being that she called Phantom. When she wrote about it many years later, helplessly the family witnessed the baffled intelligence as Phantom's hands stretched out to feel the shapes which she could reach but which meant nothing to her. She struck out at this unknowable world, hitting, kicking, blazing up in outbursts of anger that grew more and more frequent. Nobody knew how to calm the wild, destructive little animal she had become. She broke lamps, shattered dishes, stuck her fingers into everybody's plates when they were having their meals, and ate what she liked, roaming from plate to plate. In the opinion of her Uncle Fred, Helen no longer belonged with the family. He told his sister, "You really ought to put that child away, Kate. She is mentally defective, and it is not very pleasant to see her about." Aunt Ev had a different opinion. According to Aunt Ev, Helen had more sense than all the Kellers. It was only a question of finding some way to reach her mind. Then Helen learned she was no longer her mother's only darling. There was a new baby, her sister Mildred. Held and rocked in her mother's arms, this newcomer occupied the place that used to be Helen's alone. One day she rushed at the baby's cradle, overturned it, and toppled the baby out. Kate caught her just in time. How did you reach a mind that was locked in silent darkness? Helen was growing bigger and stronger day by day, and wilier, too. She got whatever she wanted by manipulating her elders. What would her future be? The thought of a 20-year-old Helen roaming through Ivy Green, uttering those choked screams to express anger, sightless and speechless and shut out from all human companionship, must have been terrifying to Kate. Helen was taken to another doctor. Although he could do nothing for her, he offered the first ray of hope. They must consult Alexander Graham Bell in Washington, D.C. He said, the same Dr. Bell who was world famous for inventing the telephone. Dr. Bell would know about teachers of deaf or blind children. So they went to Washington, the captain, Aunt Ev, and Helen, leaving Kate at home with the baby. In preparation for the trip, Kate had curled her daughter's hair with a curling iron and brushed out the bangs that framed her face. It was a wonderfully pretty face, with delicate features and an unusual expression, a questioning look under her raised eyebrows. When she came before Dr. Bell, he lifted her onto his lap and gave her his watch to play with. He was a big man, heavily bearded. Later in life, Helen remembered the watch and the beard and the sense she had of being surrounded by love when she sat on his lap. What Belle remembered was that in her well-shaped face, for all its intimations of dormant intelligence, there seemed to be an indefinable, chilling emptiness. Although he was known for inventing the telephone, Dr. Bell's lifelong interest had always been the education of the deaf. His mother had been deaf, and so was his beautiful wife. Now he instructed the captain to write to the Perkins Institute for the Blind in Boston and tell the director the Kellers needed a teacher for a deaf-blind child. It was at the Perkins School 40 years earlier, Dr. Bell explained, that another deafblind child had been taught to read and write and to speak with hand gestures. She was still alive, still at Perkins. What was done for her could surely be done for the captain's daughter. The Kellers went home to Tuscumbia, and a letter was sent to Michael Anagnos, the director of the Perkins Institution. After 1955, it was known as the Perkins School. When he answered, he said he had someone in mind. He had been discussing it with her. Could the captain tell them how much he proposed to pay? The teacher, Anagnos, had in mind was a recent graduate of Perkins, not blind, although she had been partially blind for many years. Her name was Anne Sullivan. Annie to everyone who knew her. She was 20 years old. As Annie remembered it, when Mr. Anagnos asked if she thought she could teach this little girl, she was very sure she couldn't. She wasn't trained for it. She wasn't, in fact, trained for anything. One moment she told herself she was too good for work of that kind. It would amount to burying herself in a small southern town when she longed for excitement and novelty, when she was far too young to be buried alive. The next moment she reminded herself that she needed a job, any job. She was absolutely alone in the world. Her education had been brief and sketchy. Her childhood was squalid. She had no choice then. She would have to go to Tuscumbia. Chapter 2. Tewksbury. In Massachusetts, the state poorhouse at Tewksbury was a huddle of shabby buildings, housing about 1,000 inmates, on each of whom the state spent $1.88 a week. In 1876, Annie Sullivan, aged 10, and her 5-year-old brother Jimmy had been placed in a farmer's cart and delivered to the Tewksbury poorhouse because their relatives couldn't think of anything better to do with them. To begin with, their parents had been penniless, Irish immigrants, illiterate and unskilled. Now their mother was dead. Their father, a shiftless drunk with an explosive temper, was hardly able to care for himself, and nobody wanted Annie, who was half blind from trachoma, or Jimmy, who had a tubercular hip and walked with a crutch. Neither of them had ever been to school. When they arrived in Tewksbury, the children learned they would have to be separated. Boys and men lived in one place, girls and women in another. Annie howled when she heard it, so loudly and desperately that they were allowed to stay together in the woman's ward of the hospital. That first night they slept in a single bed in what Annie remembered as a small, dark enclosure, perhaps 10 feet long at the end of the ward. It was the place where corpses were wheeled to await burial. People called it the dead house. From then on they were assigned to a bed apiece, side by side in the women's ward. One morning Jimmy developed a high fever. That night, while Annie slept, he died very quietly, so quietly that Annie never heard them roll his bed away. But when she awoke and found him gone, she knew what had happened, and ran screaming into the dead house to clutch the bars of his iron bed, screaming until she had screamed the whole place awake. People tried to pull her off, but she kicked and scratched and bit, so they dropped her on the floor and left her there. She remembered wanting to die. Meanwhile, the world outside was growing suspicious of Tewksbury. Infants who were born there died within months, people said. The place was so short of money they couldn't afford to separate the sane from the insane, or those with contagious diseases from everyone else, and rats were said to be everywhere. The children were even said to have played with the rats. A committee was formed to investigate the poorhouse. Annie heard it would be headed by Mr. Frank Sanborn, chairman of the State Board of Charities. He was the powerful one, the one who could get her out of Tewksbury and into a school where she would learn to read. When they came, Annie followed them as they moved through the building, wondering which was Mr. Sanborn. Every face looked blurry to her, but even if she could see them clearly, how could she tell who he was? And they were ready to leave. She threw herself into their midst, crying, "Mr. Sanborn, Mr. Sanborn, I want to go to school." Someone asked what was wrong with her, and she mumbled, "I can't see very well." They asked how long she had been in the poorhouse, and she said she didn't know. The committee left Annie, learned a little later that she was going to school after all, leaving Tewksbury to be educated at the Perkins Institution in South Boston. It was October, 1880, and she was 14 years old, a good-looking, dark-haired girl, sturdily built. She had her father's temper. She had occasional black moods when the world seemed hateful to her, but she was also quick-witted, thoroughly down-to-earth and tough. She would need those qualities at Perkins. The school was a famous one, largely because of the man who founded it, Dr. Samuel Gridley Howe, and his pupil, Laura Bridgman, the deaf-blind child he had taught to read, write, and speak with her fingers. Educators all over the world knew the story, and Boston was immensely proud of it. The children who came to Perkins belonged to the best middle-class families. They were bright and well-mannered, and for the most part adjusted to their blindness. They were still children, however, and quick to take advantage of anyone they felt to be inferior. On her first day at Perkins, Annie was brought to a singing class where the teacher, who was blind, asked for her name. Annie Sullivan. Spell it, the teacher said. But of course she couldn't, and the class of teenage girls burst out laughing. How old are you? Asked the teacher. She said she was 14. 14 and can't spell? Horribly humiliated, Annie had to listen to more laughter. Even the teacher laughed. She had to learn the alphabet using the raised type Dr. Howe favored. Then she learned spelling, reading, simple arithmetic, everything her classmates had known since they were 6 years old. A great gawk of a girl, starting from the beginning and mocked by everyone. Homesick for Tewksbury and lonelier than she had ever been, she cried herself to sleep every night. But she refused to let it show. She pretended she didn't care, pretended to be scornful and contemptuous of the others. "When is your brain awake?" one teacher demanded. "When I leave your class," Annie shot back. Michael Anagnos took notice of her and arranged for her to have 2 eye operations a year apart that gave her almost normal vision. She taught herself to read ordinary print and began to enjoy some of her classes. Yet she was still a rebel, claiming to despise all middle-class people, which meant everyone who was not Irish Catholic and wretchedly poor. One day Laura Bridgman came to the cottage where Annie lived. She was a thin, plain-looking woman of 50 who sewed and made beautiful lace, but had never learned to cope with the world outside. She continued to live at Perkins, spending a year in one of the residential cottages, then moving on to the next. When Laura lived in Annie's cottage, Annie learned the manual alphabet, words spelled out letter by letter into the listener's palm, in order to converse with her. Graduation drew near. Out of 4 boys and 4 girls, it was Annie Sullivan who emerged as the top student, the one who delivered the commencement address. The others went home afterwards, but Annie's only home was the Tewksbury poorhouse, where she wasn't wanted for the summer because part-time residents were discouraged. Fortunately for Annie, she was invited by her house mother, Sophia Hopkins, to spend the summer at Cape Cod. Captain Keller's first letter was forwarded to her there, and Annie wrote to Anagnos, asking if she might come back to Perkins and go over the records Dr. Howe had kept when he was Laura Bridgman's teacher. Anagnos encouraged her to do so, even though the job was not yet definitely offered. Annie returned and studied Dr. Howe's methods, which were entirely his own invention, at once straightforward and easy to understand. There was another letter from the captain, this time with a firm offer: room, board, laundry, and a salary of $25 a month. She would be treated like a member of the family. $25 every month, with all her other expenses paid, it seemed most generous to Annie. She told the captain she accepted and promised herself she would spend all her earnings on clothes, extravagant and beautiful clothes, that would be hers alone, not charity clothes or hand-me-downs. 2 months later she set out by train for Tuscumbia, a journey of several days and nights. Because she was still unsure she had made the right decision, she cried a good deal, which irritated her right eye. Pain and anxiety kept her from sleeping. When she did sleep, she was pursued by nightmares. Chapter 3. Teacher Arrives. It was a late afternoon in March 1887, 3 months before Helen's 7th birthday, and the Kellers were expecting Annie Sullivan. For 2 days one or another of them had gone with Kate to the station, meeting every train because they didn't know which one Annie would be on. Helen, too, was waiting. Standing on the sunny porch, she felt the repeated opening and shutting of doors and the vibration of many footsteps. She knew the family were tense and excited, and she wanted to find out why. That evening Annie Sullivan, her eyes inflamed, her body quivering with anxiety, arrived on the 6:30 train. She rode back in the carriage with Kate and her stepson James. They went into the garden where the captain welcomed her. Then they moved to the porch. Now Annie saw the child from close up, and saw that she was robust and strong, dirty perhaps, troublesome, but certainly not spiritless, for the face was intelligent and eager. What Helen remembered were approaching footsteps, her own outstretched hand and somebody taking it. She thought at first it was her mother, embracing her and wanting to kiss her, and when she found it was a stranger she struggled frantically to break free. She explored the unknown face, the dress, the bag, which she grabbed and tried to open. It was hard to do. She felt carefully, searching for a keyhole, and when she found it she faced the stranger, made the sign for turning a key, and pointed to the bag, because there was surely something good to eat in it. Visitors usually brought her treats, and she wanted them now, immediately. Kate took the bag away. At this the child's face grew red to the roots of her hair, as Annie wrote later to Mrs. Hopkins, and she clutched at her mother's dress while kicking violently. Annie brought out her little watch and managed to hold it against Helen's face. Once the child felt the ticking, the tempest subsided. Next morning Helen was taken to Annie's room and allowed to help unpack her trunk, where she found a doll the little girls at Perkins had sent. The doll's clothes were specially made by Laura Bridgman. Annie decided this was the moment to teach Helen her first word. I spelled DOLL slowly in her hand and pointed to the doll, and nodded my head, which seems to be her sign for possession. Annie wrote to Mrs. Hopkins. Whenever anybody gives her anything, she points to it, then to herself, and nods her head. I took the doll, meaning to give it back to her when she had made the letters, but she thought I meant to take it from her, and in an instant she was in a temper, and tried to seize the doll. I shook my head and tried to form the letters with her fingers, but she got more and more angry. I forced her into a chair and held her there until I was nearly exhausted. It occurred to Annie then that it was useless to continue the struggle, and she let the child go, but without giving her the doll. Running downstairs, she got some cake, brought it to Helen, and spelled CAKE into Helen's hand, while holding the cake out to her. Of course she wanted it and tried to take it, but I spelled the word again and patted her hand. She made the letters rapidly, and I gave her the cake, which she ate in a great hurry. Then I showed her the doll and spelled the word again. She made the letters DOL and L, and I made the other L and gave her the doll. Then Helen fled downstairs and refused to have anything to do with Annie for the rest of that day. The greatest problem I shall have to solve is how to discipline and control her without breaking her spirit, Annie wrote to Mrs. Hopkins. The spelling lesson continued, alternating with lessons in the stringing of kindergarten beads and the sewing of sewing cards, all brought from Perkins. Helen did them well and with pleasure, and there were no more displays of temper for a while. But a few days later Annie had a battle royal with Helen, and this time it was a Helen she had not met before. This time she saw the Helen who belonged to Phantom, her tyrant self. The family was in the dining room eating breakfast, and Helen stuck her hand into one plate after another to grab whatever she liked. Then she stuck her hand into Annie's plate. The hand was removed and set firmly aside. Bewildered, Helen tried again and again. Her hand was removed and set aside. Several times, many times. There was mounting fear and anger on Helen's part. The family suffered for her, longing to see her eat, no matter how, but Annie would not allow it. Then one by one the family quietly tiptoed out of the dining room. Annie gave her a spoon. Phantom hurled it to the floor. Annie pried her out of her chair and compelled her to pick up the spoon, compelled her to take up food with it, then forced the food into her mouth. When this breakfast was finished, the two of them spent an hour locked in battle over the folding of Phantom's napkin, after which Annie opened the door, letting Helen out into the warm sunshine, then went up to her room to cry her heart out. There would be more battles, often dangerous ones for Annie. Because of the bottled-up rage within her, the child possessed exceptional strength, and yet she wasn't aware of it in the sense of knowing cause and effect. She had no way of connecting the kicks and blows she aimed at this unknown someone with the someone who was hurt by them. Phantom knew nothing about other people's feelings or about other people. Phantom was a stranger to love, to reason, to everything but instinct. Once Helen refused to sit down at a table to learn any more of this finger business, and emphasized her refusal by kicking over the table. Annie set the table back in place and insisted they go on with the Lesson. Then Helen's fist flew like lightning and knocked out one of Annie's front teeth. Phantom again. Phantom making her presence felt. Helen's parents were of course aware of Helen's tyranny when she was under the spell of Phantom. They too had suffered from it, had been black and blue at times from her flat refusal to do anything except what she wanted to do. Yet they always rushed to protect their poor afflicted child. Annie knew it was not protection she needed, not even love, not yet. She needed to be taken away from the family, out of their sight and hearing, beyond the reach of their protection. It was a great deal to ask of the Kellers, but Annie did ask, and eventually they agreed. Soon Helen found herself in a place that was strange to her, where she felt lost, abandoned. She remembered one particular morning when she and the stranger began some kind of scuffling, going around and around an object that was probably a bed. The stranger showed her by firm movements that she must either lie down on the bed or else get up and dress. She refused to do either. She behaved like a wild horse. Helen said later because she was caged in this unknown place with an unknown person larger and stronger than she was. But it was only the garden cottage, with all the furniture changed, the door kept locked and their meals sent in to them. If Helen had known she was a stone's throw from Ivy Green, she would have fled to her parents, but she couldn't, no. They had taken her there by a roundabout route, without warning or explanation. Another thing she had no way of knowing was that her father stopped by every morning to look through the window. Once he saw Helen still in her nightgown sitting on the floor, her breakfast untouched on the table. It seemed to him she was the picture of despair. With tear-filled eyes he went to Cousin Leila and told her, "I have a great mind to send that Yankee girl back to Boston. It is 10 o'clock and poor little Helen has not been allowed to have breakfast." Aunt Ev, who happened to be present, told him, "No, Arthur, you must not feel that way. Miss Annie is going to be Helen's salvation." In the garden cottage Helen refused to let Annie near her. She went repeatedly to the door, as if expecting someone, and from time to time she touched her cheek, which was her sign for her mother, then shook her head sadly. The lessons continued. As Annie told Mrs. Hopkins, "She has learned 3 new words, and when I give her the objects the names of which she has learned, she spells them unhesitatingly." She was calmer, too, or else resigned. "The little savage has learned her first lesson in obedience," Annie wrote. Then word came that the captain wanted them home. This was a disappointment to Annie, who had hoped the family would allow a longer stay. But they didn't, or perhaps couldn't. A few weeks after they left Ivy Green for the cottage, the teacher and pupil were back home with the others. Annie established a routine. They spent early mornings outdoors, then came in for sewing, bead stringing, and crocheting, all of which Helen enjoyed, although Annie considered them a waste of time. They went outdoors again for gymnastics, which was followed by an hour devoted to the learning of new words. By the end of the month Helen knew 18 nouns and 3 verbs. But Phantom was not yet defeated. According to Helen, Phantom began to improve, but she still lacked the normal child's love of praise. She was not aware that she had been punished because she did not distinguish between right and wrong. She had no words for right and wrong. Although she was willing by now to repeat whatever finger plays Annie put into the palm of her hand, she had no words. Like a clever dog, she had simply learned some tricks. One morning, the morning when everything changed, they had a struggle over the words mug and water. Annie tried to impress on Helen that M-U-G was mug and nothing else, and that W-A-T-E-R was water and nothing else, but Helen kept confusing the two. Annie gave it up for the time being. Later, when Helen was playing with her new doll, Annie put an old rag doll into her lap and spelled D-O-L-L, trying to show that the same word applied to both. Helen had had enough of this spelling. Seizing the new doll, she dashed it to the floor and felt a thrill of triumph when she felt the fragments at her feet. They went outside into the warm sunshine that Helen loved, then down the path to the well house, where someone was drawing water. Annie put Helen's hand under the spout. Cool water gushed over that hand, as Annie spelled into the other hand the word W-A-T-E-R, first slowly, then rapidly. Helen was startled for a moment. Then she stood very still, her whole being fixed on the 2 hands. Something stirred inside her. It seemed to her later that somehow the mystery of language was revealed to me. I knew then that W-A-T-E-R meant the wonderful cool something that was flowing over my hand. Everything had a name. The name and the thing were closely connected. Suddenly felt a misty consciousness as of something remembered, a thrill of returning thought. Flinging herself to the ground, she asked Annie for the name of what she was lying on. She pointed to the pump and wanted its name, then the trellis. When she asked for the stranger's name, the stranger told her, "Teacher." On the way back to the house, Helen touched everything she could reach and felt its name spelled letter by letter into her hand. As soon as a thing had a name, it began trembling with life. When she fell asleep that night, she could hardly wait for morning. It was April now. A month had passed since Annie came to the Kellers, and the captain paid her first month's salary. She wrote immediately to Michael and Agnes, saying she was ready to pay back what he had lent her for train fare. He refused to take it, urging her to start a savings account first and repay him later. In the meanwhile, I need scarcely say that I am deeply interested in your little pupil. She certainly is a remarkable child. I have no doubt that ere long she will be able to talk. Able to talk! Not only to talk with her fingers, but to do so ere long. Annie had already seen a clipping from the Boston Herald, an article that said Helen was talking fluently. Michael and Agnes was surely responsible for it. Why, one might just as well say that a 2-year-old child converses fluently when he says apple, give, or baby walk, go. Annie told Mrs. Hopkins. She disliked this theatrical exaggeration, and for her pupil's sake was afraid of it. But there was nothing Annie could do to stop public fascination with Helen.